after Sandra and I had spent 7 years together. A close male friend of hers made his entrance into her life. Their conversations flourished, revealing a profound connection between them. Each evening, Sandra devoted herself to crafting 2 exquisite desserts, one for me, and the other destined for him. Yet, there was never anything amiss, until one fateful day when he posed the question, "If I had met you first, would you have chosen to marry me?" Sandra didn't respond. Instead, she shattered the vase I had gifted her into a million pieces. Sandra had been lost in thought all day. She felt the urge to speak up numerous times but kept her words to herself. Finally, I broke the silence asking, "Is something bothering you?" Sandra furrowed her brow and replied hesitantly, "Lily's husband is away on a business trip, and she's feeling scared at home all by herself. She desires my companionship, but your arm is badly hurt, and I can't shake off the worry about leaving you alone. Perhaps I should suggest she look for another friend to keep her company." She spoke with genuine concern, her voice tinged with both anxiety and tenderness. As she spoke, I couldn't help but gaze at her. Her eyes sparkled with clarity and innocence, meeting my own unwaveringly. After a brief pause, she inquired gently, "What's the matter?" I simply shook my head and replied, "It's nothing." "You can go," I said. "What about you? Are you going to be alone?" "I'll just have my mom come over to look after me," I replied. I had recently been in a minor car accident and fractured my arm, and Sandra looked terrified. She wept in the hallway outside the operating room while I underwent surgery. Whether at the hospital or at home, her attention to my needs was unwavering. She longed to stay by my side around the clock. At night, when the pain in my arm became unbearable and sleep eluded me, she would remain by my side, tears streaming down her face. Sometimes she would softly press her cheek against my other hand, while at other moments, she tenderly wiped the sweat from my forehead with a cloth. I observed all of this and felt a surge of concern that she might exhaust herself and fall ill. So I gently urged her to call it a night. She replied, "How can I possibly sleep with you in this state? What if something happens and I'm not aware of it right away? The thought alone would haunt me in my dreams. Your hands are meant for crafting beautiful homes. If anything were to happen to you, I would carry that regret for a lifetime." She then pouted playfully and inquired, "Don't you want me by your side?" During the day, whenever she had to step out for work, she would patiently wait for my mom to arrive, consistently urging her to look after me well and going over every little detail once more. It brought my mom to laughter and tears, making her exclaim, "This is my own son. How could I ever neglect him?" Yet today, after a mere 2 seconds of hesitation, she nodded and said, "Take care of yourself. I'll return as quickly as I can. Call me immediately if anything comes up. Don't leave me in suspense," she said hurriedly, grabbing only a change of clothes before rushing out. I remained seated, unmoving, smiling and waving at her as she glanced back. Once the door clicked shut, I remained motionless for a moment longer. Yet, gradually, the tension in my stiff back began to ease. Sandra's behavior had been unusual. Right from the start, her demeanor was off. Despite this, I chose not to utter another word or pose a single additional question. I was aware of her destination and the person she was about to meet. Initially, I didn't know his first name. All I knew was that his last name was Ito, and Sandra referred to him as Manager Ito. The first time our eyes met was a year ago, while I waited for Sandra at a freshly opened cafe just beneath her office. I hadn't given her a heads up, intending to ring her around noon. But then she strolled in, and the previously languid receptionist instantly sat up straighter. Sandra offered him a radiant smile, and he returned it with a knowing nod. It was a silent bond between them. I've always believed that the unspoken understanding between a man and a woman can be quite intimidating. It leads both parties to believe they are meant for one another. However, at that moment, a fleeting sensation brushed against my thoughts, and I didn't dwell on it. Later on, when Sandra spotted me, her eyes widened in surprise. She inquired why I was there, and I replied, "I'm just waiting to have lunch with you." "Why didn't you call me?" she asked, a hint of concern in her voice. "I didn't want to disturb your work," I explained. "What brought you down here?" She pouted slightly and said, "Just some work stuff, a little frustrating. I thought a walk and a cup of coffee might help me recharge. By the way, the cookies here are absolutely delightful." You simply must try them. She lifted her hand and called out, Manager Ito, could we have another plate of cookies, please? When she noticed his puzzled expression, she smiled and added, This is my husband. On that day, a serene atmosphere enveloped them both. Sandra introduced him with a tranquil demeanor, while Makoto greeted me with equal composure, even graciously taking care of our bill. Sandra remarked that the coffee here was truly exceptional. After savoring it once and being impressed, her company chose to source their afternoon tea from this charming spot. As time went by, they grew more acquainted with one another. Back then, I believed they were merely a straightforward shopkeeper and customer. Little did I know that those delectable cookies were not for sale in their shop at all. I was unaware that Makoto had sent Sandra a message asking, If I had met you first, would you have married me? Later that night at 10 o'clock, Sandra texted me. She mentioned that she had just enjoyed a hot pot meal with Lily and was ready to unwind. She expressed how exhausted she felt and that she wouldn't be able to video call me tonight. She urged me to take care of myself and to reach out if anything came up. I reassured her, telling her not to fret and that I was just fine. Turning to the cafe server, I inquired, Where's Manager Ito? Why isn't he here? The young girl with a casual smile replied, He stepped out. He left right after going downstairs. Today marks our boss's birthday, and he must be off somewhere, enjoying a romantic date with his girlfriend, likely armed with a lavish bouquet of roses. How utterly charming. I nodded, grabbed a cup of coffee to go, and set off. This city is immense. Locating two individuals is a challenge, yet it was Sandra who once gifted me a smartwatch. Just before she departed, I discreetly slipped it into her handbag. She had given it to me last year, when everyone else was adorning their loved ones' wrists with tiny rubber bands. In contrast, she presented me with a smartwatch. This way I can always keep track of where you are. I just want to make sure you're okay. Will you let me do that? She said it with a playful tone, but deep down, I understood that her concern was more about monitoring my well-being than simply knowing my whereabouts. I had once collapsed from exhaustion, and she was utterly terrified. Determined to keep a close eye on my health, she decided to monitor my condition in real time. Naturally, I welcomed her concern with open arms. That smartwatch was a high-end piece of technology, providing precise readings of my heart rate and pulse, along with accurate location tracking. Just like at this very moment, I had been on the 12th floor of the hotel for 3 hours. I didn't hurry over right away. My arm was aching a bit, so I took a painkiller along with a melatonin. Reclining on the plush bed, I listened to the gentle hum of white noise designed to lull me to sleep. Yet, despite the soothing sounds, slumber eluded me. Much like that fateful night over a month ago, the very first time I delved into Sandra's phone. She appeared to be utterly unsettled. While peeling an apple for me, she accidentally cut her hand. As she poured a glass of water, it spilled everywhere. In a heartbeat, her composure shattered. In a fit of hysteria, she swept everything off the table, including the custom vase I had crafted for our wedding anniversary. As I surveyed the chaotic scene, I fell into silence. Sandra eventually found her composure. Gazing at the shattered vase, a look of regret crossed her face. She turned to me as if she had something to say, but ultimately, the words never left her lips. With a quiet resolve, she began to clean up the mess. Later, I found myself waking up in the dead of night, only to discover that she was gone. The soft glow of light illuminated the living room, revealing Sandra sprawled on the sofa, her form clearly affected by the several glasses of red wine she had consumed. Her long hair cascaded over the edge, and her tear-streaked face rested against the cushion, which was now damp from her sorrow. In that moment, my heart felt sluggish and burdensome. With a heart almost extinguished, I unlocked her phone. The chat window remained open, and there, a message awaited from someone whose name was merely Ito, sent earlier that afternoon. If our paths had crossed first, would you have said "I do" to me? Sandra remained silent, offering no words in response. Yet that night, a piece of my heart departed with her message. I reached the hotel by 6 a.m. With my ID in hand, I placed all my belongings on the front desk. Sandra is my wife, and I need to know which room she booked, I insisted. If you refuse to help me, I'll have no choice but to call the police. I simply didn't have the energy to engage in any further argument. I was utterly spent both physically and mentally. The receptionist stared at me in disbelief for what felt like an eternity. Her expression shifted from shock to uncertainty, and finally settled on pity. "Please hold on a moment," she said, her voice softening. "I'll look into this for you right away." She promptly provided me with the room number, and inquired if I needed any assistance. I smiled and gently shook my head. After gathering my belongings, I made my way upstairs. Sandra didn't keep me waiting for long. I had been waiting outside the door for no more than 30 minutes when it finally creaked open. Makoto stood there, gripping the doorknob, his expression a mixture of disappointment and despair. Behind him, a delicate hand rested gently on his arm. A voice crackled through, "Makoto, I appreciate it, but I'm afraid we can't proceed with this." Appreciate? Appreciate for what? Sorry. What exactly was there to apologize for? It felt like they were speaking in a secret language just between them. A shadow of sorrow crossed Makoto's face. "Sandra, Alex," he interrupted. In that instant, the atmosphere felt as though it had turned to ice. Sandra quickly withdrew her hand from Makoto's arm, as if it had been scalded, yet she remained sheltered behind him. I questioned, "Aren't you going to leave?" Sandra's face drained of color, her voice quivering with anxiety. I felt the same unease. The hand I had hidden behind my back trembled uncontrollably. I believed I was mentally prepared and could face this situation with composure. Yet when the moment arrived, I found myself struggling to stay upright. It was as if every ounce of my strength had vanished in a heartbeat. With a faint whisper, I inquired, "Where's the car?" "In the underground parking garage," came the reply. "Let's go," I said, but as I moved, my arm, bound in a sling, bumped painfully against the wall, causing me to gasp. "Alex!" Sandra rushed over to steady me. "Don't touch me," I grumbled, but she averted her gaze, stubbornly determined to ignore my plea. I raised my hand, ready to shove her aside. In an instant, Makoto lunged forward, shielding Sandra with his body. "What are you planning to do?" he challenged. I scoffed. "Do what? What do you imagine I'm going to do? Strike her?" He loomed over Sandra like a guardian of justice, turning to me as he proclaimed, "I won't let you lay a finger on her." I nodded in response. "All right, then keep her. Just make sure she divorces me first." Sandra shrugged off Makoto's hand, her voice rising as she declared, "Alex, it's time to go home." Hurt by her rejection, Makoto replied, "I'm just trying to help you." Sandra, stepping back, retorted sharply, "Makoto, I want nothing to do with you." "I don't need your help," she said, her gaze fixed firmly ahead, entirely ignoring Makoto. Turning to me, she continued, "Alex, let's just go home." I added quickly, "Alex, please let me explain. Yesterday was Makoto's birthday, and he didn't have any friends around, so he asked me to spend some time with him. I just celebrated his birthday with him, and nothing significant occurred between us. I realize now that it was wrong for me to deceive you, and I sincerely apologize. My only fear was that you would become upset and overanalyze the situation. I realize I was mistaken. If it bothers you, I won't meet him again. He's merely a friend. Alex, please don't shut me out. Say something, will you? Don't leave me in suspense." Since we arrived home, Sandra has been talking nonstop. Explanations, apologies, and self-recrimination swirled in my mind. I longed to speak, yet it felt as though my throat were packed with cotton, rendering me unable to utter even a single syllable. I was at a loss, uncertain of how to begin or what words could possibly convey my thoughts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to say, each word labored, "Sandra, we need to get a divorce." My words sent a shiver through Sandra, causing her to tremble uncontrollably. She grasped the hem of her garment and squeezed her eyes shut. When she finally reopened them, it appeared as though she had wrestled with her tumultuous feelings and emerged composed. She spoke softly. "Nothing ever happened between us. We just sat together, sipping our drinks and sharing stories. Alex, please don't react this way. I can see your anger and I know I messed up. I shouldn't have gone out with him. But you have to trust me. I never did anything to betray you." "What does it truly mean to betray me?" I asked, my voice steady. "You must have embraced him, perhaps even shared a kiss. I can smell the smoke lingering on you and right here," I said, gesturing to her lips. There's a mark, evidence of a bite. Sandra stood frozen, her lips pressed together in a tight line. I gazed at her, my heart heavy with sorrow. How much further does this need to go? Being found in bed together? You spent the entire night in the same room. How can you expect me to believe a word you say? Sandra, how can I possibly trust you? Sandra's head hung low in resignation, her eyes fluttering shut as her lashes quivered softly. With a voice thick with emotion, she confessed, Alex, I made a mistake. I'm not sure what overtook me. It felt like I lost my senses. But I promise you, nothing further ever happened between us. I implore you, for the sake of the years we've shared, grant me another opportunity.
Besides, I'm expecting.
We're about to welcome a new life. She gently took my hand and guided it to rest on her belly. I stood frozen, my gaze slowly drifting to her stomach. Confusion washed over me. In that fleeting moment, I instinctively withdrew my hand. What did you just say? I asked. I'm pregnant, she replied. When did you find out? But Sandra fell silent, her hand balling into a tight, pale fist. I clenched my teeth, feeling like a caged animal. My voice came out hoarse and shaky as I confronted her. So you knew all along and kept it from me? You knew and still chose to be with Makoto last night? Sandra, what on earth are you thinking? You can't possibly want this baby, can you? Is it all because of Makoto? You deceitful woman, how could you? How dare you use this precious child as a pawn? I want a divorce, Sandra. Don't say another word, I interjected. This year, Sandra and I celebrate our 7th year together. People often ask, aren't you both experiencing the 7-year itch? I chuckle and reply, we've only been married for 3 years. But you two have been together for 7 years now. Perhaps it's time to consider starting a family. Yet in truth, we had never used any form of contraception since the very start. For a time, Sandra was filled with anxiety over this. She was at a loss as to why she couldn't conceive. We visited the hospital for a series of tests, and the results revealed that our chances of starting a family were slim. My health markers were all normal. The issue lay with her. To shield Sandra from any unwanted scrutiny, I would respond to inquiries about why we didn't have children with, I'm still savoring our time together, just the two of us. No one will ever take Sandra from me. We both eagerly anticipated the day we would welcome a child into our lives. I often envisioned the moment when we would discover that Sandra was expecting, a moment bursting with joy. However, she chose not to share this news with me. Despite her pregnancy and the checkup she had, she kept it a secret. I didn't have to ponder for long. It was clear she was hesitant about whether to bring the baby into the world. Why? Because of Makoto's presence. The sight of another man cast doubt on her desire to have a child with me. How utterly absurd, how deeply tragic. A torrent of emotions cascaded through my veins, crashing over me in relentless waves. At last, I couldn't hold it any longer. I retched violently. There I was, gripping the toilet, kneeling on the cold floor, as a profound agony surged within me, as if my very organs were rearranging themselves. Sandra hammered on the door with an urgent desperation, imploring me to let her in, to step outside. Her voice, a gentle plea, echoed softly from the other side as she urged me not to take my health lightly. I found myself sitting there, disheveled and overwhelmed, feeling like the most wretched man on earth. The thought of ending it all with Grace crossed my mind, yet my dignity had been crushed the instant Sandra began to falter. That night I settled into the guest room. Perhaps exhaustion had taken its toll, for I drifted into slumber almost immediately. At the break of dawn, just before I stirred, Sandra had already laid out a lavish breakfast. As I stepped into the dining area, she stood up with a strained smile, attempting to mask her feelings. She likely had a restless night. Her appearance was dreadful, her lips devoid of color. In the past, such a sight would have shattered my heart. But now my emotions felt like a stagnant pool, lifeless and still. Alex, you should eat something, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Sandra, we need to talk. She lingered in silence for what felt like an eternity, then finally nodded. All right. Where do I even begin? I turned to Sandra and added, I gave you a chance. I even envisioned a scenario where things didn't have to escalate to this point. Sandra was taken aback, gazing at me with a hint of bewilderment. I smirked and said, "That day, when Makoto asked you whether you would have married him if you had met him first, it was that single question that shattered you. You broke down, weeping uncontrollably. That night, as you lay passed out on the sofa in a drunken stupor, I couldn't help but glance at your phone. I had always believed that rummaging through a partner's device was a breach of trust. Once you begin down that path, a rift inevitably emerges. If two people lack trust, what's the point of remaining together?" Yet, despite that perspective, I still succumbed to the urge. My words left Sandra momentarily paralyzed. She leaned back slightly, a subconscious instinct to distance herself. Her fingers clutched the hem of her shirt, her eyes pleading as she spoke in a barely audible whisper. But I didn't respond to him. I rubbed my weary eyes and replied, "Yes, your silence was telling. Not responding is still a form of answer." Once more, the air grew thick with an uncomfortable silence that enveloped the room. Sandra attempted to speak several times, her lips parting, yet no words emerged. At last she spoke. "If you've seen those messages, you must realize that I never overstepped any boundaries with him. I always considered him a friend. The night before last I had too much to drink, which tangled up my emotions, but that's where it ended. It didn't progress beyond that, Alex. I swear, I never betrayed you." I avoided looking at Sandra and let out a long weary sigh. On April 3rd, we made plans to catch a movie together. It felt like ages since we last shared that experience. I purchased the tickets, secured a reservation at a lovely restaurant, and was filled with excitement for our outing. However, out of the blue, you informed me that you couldn't make it because your boss had compelled you to work late. Yet, the truth was that it was Makoto who had invited you to go sing instead. Every night, you would prepare 2 delightful desserts at home, one to save for me in the evening and another to bring to him the next morning. The sole exception was February 14th, when you crafted matcha chocolates, 13 exquisite pieces of chocolate. The elevator in your building demands an internal card for access. Makoto often grumbled about the lengthy waits he faced while delivering food. To address this, you informed your boss that your husband needed a card to pick you up during your late shifts. In reality, however, you handed it over to Makoto instead. On your birthday, after I had drifted off to sleep, you quietly made your way downstairs at the stroke of midnight. It was there that Makoto presented you with a beautiful bracelet. He asked you if he was the first to wish you a happy birthday, to which you replied with a joyful yes. Your unspoken connection is evident. He says, "Go," and you echo, "Go." You bring up the idea of a penthouse, and he responds with a 1. When you confess your fatigue, he assures you that the coffee is on its way. As you switched vehicles, you invited him for a test drive. He jokingly mentioned that someone mistook you for a couple, prompting you to respond with a shy facepalm emoji. Each evening during your commute home from work, you engage in a lively chat with him that lasts for 27 minutes. How long has it been since we conversed like this in a single day, other than during our honeymoon phase? The Sandra who engages in lively banter with Makoto feels like a different person to me. No, perhaps different isn't quite the right word. The Sandra I knew from university was full of life, bubbly, chatty, and with a hint of childlike whimsy. But the person standing across from me was a stranger, a shadow of my former self. The sensation of ants crawling beneath my skin threatened to overwhelm me. Sandra's head drooped lower and lower as she spoke in a barely audible voice. I only ever saw him as a confidant. When I was feeling low, I sometimes needed someone to talk to. We were merely sharing conversations. Alex, what will it take for you to trust me? A heavy wave of helplessness crashed over me. Sandra, how far does it have to go before it's deemed cheating? Your intimacy, your understanding, feels like a guillotine poised over my head. Is it truly cheating when the blade descends? Or is it when you dangle it over me? The bullet rested in the chamber long before the trigger was ever pulled. I had my daydreams. I adore Sandra. We've shared 7 years together, and I can recall every little thing she did for me. How could she possibly choose to betray me for someone like that? Yet, as I powered down my phone and settled into bed, I realized that some truths simply couldn't be ignored. After reading those messages and uncovering everything, how could I possibly continue to trust you? Whenever you slip out of my view and engage in anything out of the ordinary, I can't shake the feeling that you're going to meet him. In that instant, I realized that our relationship had already been buried beneath your choices. It was only when Sandra finally consented to meet Makoto for one last drink that he uttered, "Perhaps this is the way I can finally let go." "Sandra, have some compassion for me," I pleaded. "All right," she responded. In that instant, the trigger was pulled. I experienced a rebirth through death. "Sandra, let's end this marriage," I urged. But she firmly disagreed, insisting she would consider any compromise, anything at all, except for divorce. She promised that she would always whip up desserts just for me, join me for lunch downstairs at my office, return home promptly every day, and steer clear of the cafe forever. As I watched her bustling around, eager to make me happy, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. This was entirely superfluous. I've never been fond of post-facto compensations. Divorce is a challenging journey. I only truly understood its weight when I found myself wanting one. When one side refuses to budge, the only option left is to initiate legal proceedings. The journey from filing to trial spans at least a month. If there are no significant errors, the initial hearing will not result in a divorce being granted. Consequently, you will need to wait for 6 months before you can file once more. Will it be granted a second time? Perhaps, maybe, or possibly. It's an agonizing thought. That's why I've made up my mind to leave. What are you doing? Where are you going? Sandra's voice echoed, but I brushed off her questions as I kept shoving my clothes into the suitcase. She lost control, tossing my belongings around in frustration. "What more do you want from me? I've already owned up to my mistakes, apologized, and vowed it won't happen again. Why won't you forgive me? Am I truly beyond redemption? Can't you find it in your heart to give me just one chance, considering all the years we've shared? Alex, I'm pleading with you. Can't we just be all right again?" The clothes in my hands crumpled under my grip as I flung them forcefully onto the floor. "Sandra, I'm begging you. Please stop repulsing me," I exclaimed. Sandra, frightened, took a step back, her eyes glistening with tears. She clutched her stomach, desperately gripping the doorframe for support. "I won't divorce you. I'm pregnant and you can't leave me now," were the last words that tumbled from her lips before she collapsed. The threat of miscarriage loomed over her. If her symptoms intensified, it could spell disaster. The doctor's assessment pointed to the turmoil of her emotions and the weight of her anxiety as the root of her condition. Her parents hurried over, their voices filled with anger as they reprimanded me. They grilled me on how I was caring for Sandra, accusing me of bullying her and causing her distress. I felt too drained, too weary to respond. Sandra glanced at them anxiously and interjected, "Mom, Dad, please stop." "Alex?" I slowly lifted my gaze, fixing my eyes on the family of 3 standing before me. "I want a divorce from Sandra." "What did you just say?" I said, "I want a divorce from Sandra." "You scoundrel." Her father seethed, anger boiling over as he swung a fist towards my face. I quickly seized his arm with a firm grip. Sandra screamed in a desperate attempt to step in, but her mother restrained her, saying, "You've coddled him far too much. You're expecting a child and he wants a divorce. Is there someone else?" Sandra froze in disbelief. I couldn't help but scoff as I replied, "Sandra, this marriage is finished." The uproar stirred up the truth, and soon everyone was aware of my intention to end things with Sandra. Initially, my parents struggled to comprehend my situation, but once I revealed the truth behind it all, an unexpected hush fell over them. Sandra's parents, too, didn't come to search for me. They must have discovered the reality of the matter. Yet, through it all, only Sandra remained resolute. Throughout her time in the hospital, she reached out to me numerous times, but I chose not to answer any of her calls. Frustrated, she then contacted my parents. Initially, their tone was harsh, but as Sandra revealed her vulnerability and repeatedly spoke of the child, my parents began to soften. Perhaps it's time to let go. After all, Sandra is expecting, I thought. Yes, she is pregnant and everyone assumes this should grant her a free pass. Yet, in truth, it feels like the final straw that broke the camel's back. My love for her ran deep. I eagerly anticipated the arrival of our child, but what about her? She betrayed me deeply, leaving me wounded, the gash so severe I could see the bone beneath. The anguish of being betrayed by someone I hold dear haunts me with every passing moment. I loathe her now. My trust has vanished completely. How can I possibly imagine spending the rest of my life by her side? Must I endure until our marriage decays entirely before I can finally break free? Sandra spent 15 long days in the hospital. During that time, Makoto came to visit her just once. He arrived with a vibrant fruit basket and a bouquet of flowers, claiming he was there to see how she was doing. Yet, for the first time, Sandra regarded him with an icy stare. "Leave and don't bother coming back," Makoto uttered, his voice thick with tension. He paused for a few seconds, then managed a strained smile and asked, "What do you mean by that? You've stopped answering my calls and messages. So what is it, can we not even be friends anymore? Does Wang still have a misunderstanding? I could go explain things to him," he began. "Makoto," Sandra interrupted, "let's avoid contacting each other from now on. I wouldn't have been aware of this if Makoto hadn't come to tell me himself." He took a drag from his cigarette, his expression steeped in despair. "I thought I had a chance to win her heart. You just happened to arrive before I did. But now it's all gone. I surrender, she belongs to you," he lamented. His sheer self-pity sparked a laugh within me. "Did Sandra send you?" Makoto asked with a smirk. "Of course, I'll fulfill her last request to me." "Really? A profound love without regrets." I dialed Sandra's number, and as soon as she answered, she exclaimed, "Alex, I'll be discharged soon." "You're still coming to get me, right?" I asked. "We need to end this." "What do you mean?" "The baby," Sandra exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. "Do you hate me so much that you want to end our child's life?" "Sandra," I replied gently, hoping to calm her. "If you decide to have this baby and one day they ask why their parents aren't together, what will you say?" Even during her pregnancy or while breastfeeding, the truth is I can't just walk away, even if I file for divorce. "But these times will fade away, and I will certainly divorce her," Sandra gasped, her voice trembling. "Why? I've already apologized to you. I've humbled myself, begged you through tears. What more can I do? Just for a single mistake, do I really deserve a death sentence? Can't you grant me one chance? Alex, is your heart carved from stone?" It was the first time she resolutely cut me off, declaring, "I won't terminate the pregnancy and I won't leave you." After her discharge from the hospital, Sandra returned home but chose not to reach out to me. However, I received calls from her mother one after another. Initially, her voice was warm and friendly, but soon it shifted to irritation and embarrassment. "Alex," she chided, "you're a man. Can't you show a little more understanding? Sandra simply had a male friend. Nothing significant transpired. Must you be so harsh?" I questioned, feeling the weight of the moment. How unkind life can be. I had braced myself for the worst. Yet the news of Sandra's mother being hospitalized hit me unexpectedly. "What happened?" I inquired of a friend, genuinely concerned. He shook his head in confusion. "I'm not sure. It seems she had an argument with Sandra's dad, but no one knows the real reason behind it." "How is she doing now?" "She's awake, but she's crying and screaming, saying she wants to end it all." I let out a sigh of relief, grateful that she was awake. My mother inquired, "Aren't you going to pay her a visit?" I was preoccupied with work and didn't lift my gaze. "No," I replied. "Now that I've chosen to go my separate way, there's no sense in offering false hope. It's peculiar how swiftly people can mature. Initially, I believed that Sandra's betrayal would bring me to the brink of despair, that I would be consumed by unbearable agony. Yet, as the days unfolded, the pain began to fade. I gradually began to confront the painful truth that my marriage had unraveled. Although I hadn't intended to visit Sandra's mother, she reached out to me, expressing a desire to meet. "I have no ulterior motives, Alex," she assured me. "I have a few things I need to share with you." Her voice trembled, wavering with sadness and a rough edge. It caused me to pause, uncertainty gnawing at my heart for what felt like an eternity. But ultimately I decided to go. In just a matter of days, it was clear that Sandra's mother appeared significantly worn and exhausted. Sandra, too, appeared frail, having shed an alarming amount of weight that made her seem on the verge of collapsing. She looked lost, helpless, and engulfed in pain. With a trembling voice, she said, "Alex, thank you so much. Thank you for coming to see my mom." I nodded at her before stepping into the hospital room. Sandra's father had betrayed their family. To put it more precisely, he had discovered what he deemed true love and wished to divorce. The woman who had captured his heart is 2 years younger than Sandra. He claimed he had never experienced such harmony with anyone before. They dine together, fish side by side, embark on adventures and share infinite conversations. He expressed that he feels rejuvenated, alive once more. He insisted he had devoted his entire life to this family, so why shouldn't he have the chance to live for himself just this once? Sandra's mother grew increasingly agitated as the words tumbled out. He claims that his only obligation is to me and this family, insisting that it's I and our household who have held him back. How could he say that? Has he ever considered the sacrifices I've made? How can he brush aside all our shared years with nothing but a few dismissive words? He's being deceitful, yet he spins it as though it's an act of nobility. I won't allow them to be together. I'd rather die than see that happen. If he's choosing to divorce me for his new lover, it's absolutely out of the question. Sandra's mother gasped, clutching my hand tightly, her body shaking with emotion. Alex, you understand me, don't you? You truly grasp what I'm facing, don't you? Only you know the struggles I've endured. He's pushing me to my limits. With her heartfelt words, I finally realized why she felt the need to see me and share all of this. It turns out that true understanding of pain only comes when you experience it yourself. Previously, she casually dismissed Sandra's error as a trivial disagreement and accused me of being overly sensitive. But now that it's happening to her, she claims it's pushing her to the brink of despair. I didn't offer her solace or pile on more misery when she was already down. Once she had voiced her thoughts, I gently brushed her hand aside. Meeting her eager gaze, I replied curtly, "Get some rest. I have things to take care of, so I'll be leaving now." "Alex," she called softly. As I exited the hospital room, I found Sandra waiting just outside, her eyes filled with a wistful longing. "Can we talk?" "Talk? About what?" Even amidst the divorce, all I wanted was to settle things, not to discuss them. "I have 2 questions for you. First, if your dad hadn't brought up the divorce but instead had a close female friend, would you feel sympathy for your dad or pity for your mom? Second, your dad's deep bond with this woman didn't just emerge out of nowhere. Why is he mentioning divorce at this moment?" After uttering these words, I turned away, disregarding Sandra's barely restrained emotions. Her father was resolute. He was prepared to walk away with nothing just to finalize the divorce. This revelation left everyone stunned. For as long as she could remember, Sandra had been known for her loving family and privileged upbringing. She had never encountered any struggles within her family circle. Her father was a figure of admiration and a source of unwavering support for her. She often expressed her desire to marry a man like her father. As for her mother, whose gentle demeanor and calm nature were qualities Sandra deeply admired, she was the embodiment of the person she aspired to become. After graduation, Sandra leveraged her family's connections to secure a position at a company, and she now holds the role of a mid-level manager. She hadn't encountered many social struggles. The only genuine turmoil in her life was likely our divorce. I understood Sandra well. She was aware of her mistakes yet didn't believe they were as significant as they truly were. She chose to acknowledge her faults, naively thinking that mere admission would suffice. What's the fuss all about? Yet, the state of her father appeared to jolt her back to reality. It had been many days since she last reached out to me, yet she frequently lingered just outside our neighborhood. Her car would sit idling there for hours on end. One day she suddenly called out to me. We settled onto a bench by the roadside, enveloped in a long silence, until Sandra finally broke it, saying, "I've given a lot of thought to the questions you posed." Later, I inquired about his reasons for wanting a divorce at this moment. He remarked that my mother's demeanor gave him the impression that cultivating a close friendship with another woman was permissible. He believed I could empathize with his feelings for someone else and wouldn't hold it against him, as I had pursued similar paths myself. Given the circumstances, he figured we wouldn't object to his request for a divorce, Sandra said, her hands shaking. Her voice wavered as she continued. I confronted that girl, hoping to convince her to end things with my dad. But she said, that girl exclaimed, "Don't you have a close male friend as well? You didn't even want to have a baby because of him." The only difference is that you simply lacked the courage. In that sense, you ought to take a lesson from your father. I couldn't help but wonder, how could he do that? They had shared their love all along. And yet just one day before he filed for divorce, he embraced my mom tenderly before walking out the door. Sandra buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She wept for her father's betrayal, for the shattering of their marriage and family. Yet her sorrow evoked no pity in me. "Alex, do you truly hate me so much?" My grip on the bench tightened, and a sharp thorn grazed my finger, sending a jolt of pain through me. Memories of those uncomfortable moments flooded back, and I couldn't help but recall, initially, I felt a deep sadness upon learning about your close friendship with another man. It truly upset me. Later, when he confessed and you remained silent, I found myself in a whirl of confusion. I wondered, at the very least you hadn't betrayed me, had you? Yet you chose not to sever ties. You carried on with those same actions, deepening my suffering. Until you finally agreed to meet him that night, I was flooded with a sense of relief. They say the one caught in the whirlwind is often the last to notice what's happening. You didn't reply to his confession, not for lack of desire, but because you simply couldn't bring yourself to do it. You fell apart, overwhelmed by sorrow, and tears streamed down your cheeks. Even though you were aware of his feelings for you, you couldn't bear to create any distance between you. Letting go was simply not an option. You decided to share a drink with him, enticed by thoughts that swirled in your mind. What held you back? Perhaps it was your final vestige of moral integrity. Sandra, the moment I discovered your feelings for him, I was consumed by hatred for you. She gazed at me, anguish reflecting in her eyes, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of relief that washed over me. But all of that is behind us now. Hatred runs too deep. It wounds not only others but ourselves as well. It serves no purpose. Sandra, if you genuinely feel remorse for me, then let us end this decisively. Agree to the divorce and allow us both to retain a shred of dignity. At the conclusion of our conversation, Sandra brushed away her tears and asked, "Do you have time tomorrow? Will you accompany me for the abortion? Just think of it as one last moment together." That sunny morning marked the day Sandra and I finalized our divorce. She asked, "Can we still be friends after the divorce?" I shook my head. "Let's not. We both need a fresh start." Sandra tried to smile, but ultimately tears fell. "Alex, I'm so sorry." I accepted those 3 words with quiet composure. I turned and walked away without glancing back. Sandra's parents were still creating a commotion behind me. I learned that her father had already established a new home elsewhere. Meanwhile, her mother continued to argue and hurl insults daily. Yet nothing could weaken her father's resolve. She began to blame Sandra, claiming that it was Sandra who set the precedent and swayed her father. One dramatic episode followed another, and I didn't even have to witness it firsthand. Countless others shared the tales with me. Initially, I still encountered Sandra from time to time, but as time went by, those meetings became increasingly rare. Her mother's outrageous behavior impacted both her father's career and Sandra's own professional life to differing extents. Some people expressed their sympathy with sighs, while others offered mockery, and still, others simply observed the unfolding drama with keen interest. Even my mom couldn't resist saying, "Thank goodness you managed to escape that situation early on, or we would have faced the fallout too. What's going on with that family?" I had no response to offer her. Later, I unexpectedly crossed paths with Makoto. He was in a new relationship and seemed genuinely remorseful, reflecting on his foolish past while sharing how he had moved forward. A look of relief washed over his face, as if he were eager to laugh away the grudges that once lingered between us. I found it utterly absurd. Are you actually trying to apologize? Or are you merely looking for some psychological solace, Mr. Ito? I have no duty to soothe your conscience when you have undeniably shattered my marriage and my family. This burden of guilt belongs to you alone. All I had to do was to sever the ties that bound me to the past and forge ahead. I have my career and my family to focus on. A failed marriage may sting momentarily, but it will never condemn me to a lifetime of suffering. The secret lay in moving forward with the times. Sandra first encountered Makoto shortly after he launched his cafe. In order to ensure timely food deliveries, he requested Sandra's permission to utilize the company's internal elevator. Sandra nodded her agreement. Later on, she found herself wondering whether she would have said yes had it been someone else. Probably not. It was Makoto who had captivated her. Just one look from him and he was etched in her memory. When they crossed paths for the second time, Makoto expressed his gratitude by treating her to a cup of coffee. Sandra asked her boss for an extra card for her husband, and in return, he gifted her a special cookie crafted from his secret recipe. This exchange sparked a friendly rapport between Sandra and Makoto, allowing them to grow more acquainted with one another. The afternoon tea orders from her company were assigned to Makoto. She exchanged contact information with him, and not long after, they unexpectedly crossed paths while hiking, a shared passion they both relished. In that moment, Sandra experienced a refreshing wave of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. Makoto asked, "What do you say we hike together from now on?" Sandra offered a warm smile but held back her agreement. Something just didn't feel right to her. However, their paths crossed again at a concert, an event that Alex had originally promised to attend with her, but had to cancel due to work commitments. Eventually, she found herself saying yes to Makoto's proposition. Though Sandra kept her feelings to herself, a sense of disappointment lingered within her. However, Makoto's presence seemed to alleviate that disappointment, as they quickly discovered a wealth of shared interests. This remarkable compatibility captivated Sandra. In the course of their easygoing chat, she casually remarked how she prepared desserts for Alex every day. Makoto sighed with envy. "If a woman prepared desserts for me every day, I'd absolutely adore her," he mused. Sandra felt her heart quicken. "Should I whip up some for you?" she asked, a hint of excitement in her voice. "Really?" he replied, a spark of hope lighting his eyes. "Absolutely," she confirmed, believing it was a harmless gesture. After all, how could one more portion hurt? On Valentine's Day, Makoto sighed. "After being single for so long, I can hardly bear the scent of romance." Meanwhile, an employee named Shaoli was surprised to receive 13 delightful pieces of matcha chocolate that day. "I'm absolutely envious, it makes me yearn for love," Sandra blurted out impulsively. "But do you really need to be in love to enjoy chocolates? I can share some with you." Without a second thought, Sandra continued, unbothered by the implication. In that instant, did she truly wish for Makoto to remain untouched by love? Did Sandra harbor feelings for him? Seemed likely. Yet, whether her affection crossed the threshold into love was a question she hadn't pondered. One thing was clear, though Makoto's feelings were undeniably entwined with love. How could she possibly be unaware? Women are innately attuned to such matters. Yet, she wished for Makoto to remain silent. She couldn't and didn't wish to fulfill his desires. She cherished her joyful family and adored her husband. For Sandra, Makoto could only ever be a friend. Yet, in the end, Makoto mustered the courage to confess his feelings, which caused Sandra deep anguish. The pain weighed so heavily on her that she found herself avoiding Alex, as if his very presence stood in the way of her peace. Sandra remained silent in response to Makoto's question, and he feigned ignorance, letting the moment slip away. Their interactions continued as before, yet an unmistakable shift lingered in the air. For instance, Makoto's gestures grew increasingly tender and intimate, while Sandra grappled with uncertainty about bringing a baby into the world. It was undeniable, Sandra was pregnant. 15 days after Makoto posed that question, she ought to have been elated. She should have hurried to share the news with Alex. Yet she remained silent, seated in the car for an entire hour, taking the diagnosis and ripping it to shreds before finally heading off to meet Makoto for a night of karaoke. Sandra found herself enveloped in a whirlwind of confusion. Thoughts swirled in her mind about the baby, Alex, and Makoto. She knew she needed to sort through her feelings. That night, emotions spiraled out of control. They embraced passionately, exchanging kisses that ignited a fire between them. As Makoto began to unbutton her clothes, just shy of crossing the final threshold, Sandra, overwhelmed, gently pushed him away. "No," she replied softly. "Not right now." She still hadn't made up her mind. She was married, pregnant, and required more time. Yet what she didn't realize was that her time had run out. When Sandra opened the door and caught sight of Alex, her heart plummeted. Initially, Sandra dismissed the situation as insignificant. In truth, she was engaging in a little self-deception. She had simply made a new friend, someone with whom she connected effortlessly. She hadn't cheated or betrayed Alex. He had every right to feel angry or upset. She would say she was sorry, but that was the extent of it. Divorce? That felt like an overwhelming prospect. Ever since Alex discovered the truth, Sandra's emotions had been in turmoil, constantly oscillating between guilt and frustration. When she saw Alex in pain and sadness, guilt washed over her like a relentless tide. However, every time he brought up divorce, irritation bubbled up within her. She had merely committed a blunder, one that wasn't grave enough to warrant such an ultimatum. Why couldn't he find it in himself to forgive her just this once? Sandra was bewildered, that is, until her father voiced his own wish for a divorce. During that period, Sandra found herself in a terrible mood. Her mother joined in her grievances, lamenting about Alex's immaturity and lack of forgiveness. It was just a minor issue, but he acted as if the world was crumbling around us, she would say. Life is neither a novel nor a fantasy. It's not meant to be flawless. Every family faces its own struggles. No one is without fault. To navigate through life, there are times when you must choose to look the other way. At the dinner table, her father paused thoughtfully before responding. So, you believe this isn't significant? Her mother, unfazed by the conversation, replied nonchalantly, Of course not. What's the big deal? That's just the way the world is these days, her father declared. I've fallen in love with someone else. Let's get a divorce. I'll walk away with nothing. He had been with that woman for 2 years. I had to refer to her as a girl, considering she was 2 years younger than Sandra. Her father confessed it was the first time he felt such a strong affection for someone, saying, I've given up so much for my family and career. Is it too much to ask to live for myself just this once? As she listened to her father recount his experiences with that girl, Sandra felt as though she had been struck. The parallels were striking. Her father and that girl mirrored her own relationship with Makoto, so painfully similar. She felt utterly exposed in front of everyone, a wave of humiliation washing over her, accompanied by sharp pain and deep shame. Yet she couldn't flee the scene, not when her mother had just collapsed. If your father hadn't brought up divorce but had instead formed a close friendship with another woman, would you find it in your heart to sympathize with him, or would your compassion lie with your mother? This bond between your father and that woman didn't blossom overnight. Why is he bringing up divorce at this moment? Alex's 2 questions struck her like a lightning bolt. At last, Sandra grasped the truth. One only truly feels pain when the blade pierces one's own flesh. The catalyst for her decision to pursue divorce had been her mother's frantic outcry. You're just like your father. The same tired excuses for cheating, how revolting, Alex remarked, his voice dripping with disdain. Can you please stop revolting me? He continued. At least your father has the decency to admit he was unfaithful. But you, Sandra, can't even muster the courage to own up to it. You're even more pathetic than he is. Sandra shook with emotion, tears streaming down her face. No, it's not like that, she sobbed. Yet, deep down, didn't she despise her father? Yes, she did. Confusion enveloped her. She couldn't even bear to talk to him. A troubling thought crossed her mind. Did Alex feel the same way about her? A wave of fear washed over Sandra. From that instant onward, a sense of regret began to seep into her heart.